at the library, we're going to teach you guys how to make some very simple mask patterns. It's going to be much like this one, just some simple pleats in it. You can make these masks in all kinds of different sizes. We'll make sure that we also list the general sizes to make a kind of toddler, so 3 to 4 age kid mask. Your older kids right up to your adults, and it's super easy to change the size if that size, the dimensions don't work for you. Very, very easy to change it with this particular pattern. So the first step is you're going to take your material. If you're using a material that has patterns on it, you want to make sure that you have the right side, or the side that has the pattern the brightest on the inside. If you're using a plain solid material, if it's a color that is brighter on one side, put the bright sides together. This white material, it doesn't really matter. It looks the same on both sides. You don't have to pin it together. I find it's a little bit easier as you're going through if you do pin it together, especially with the elastics. So you're going to line it up with your pattern or your brighter side on the inside, and your elastics are going to go in the corners. When you do it, you want to make sure that your elastic is stretched out and flat in between. I tend to put them in diagonally. You can put them in straight across, but I've found that diagonally tends to work a little bit better. So you're going to put your second one on top, and then I pin right through the elastic to hold it where I want it. You're going to do the same. You want, if you have a longer side and a shorter side, depending on how you cut your material, the elastic is going to go along your shorter side. Your longer side is going to be elastic free. If your elastic is curled up, make sure you stretch it out so that it's flat, so then it doesn't end up twisted behind your ears, which would not be the most comfortable. So same thing, you're going to tuck it in the corner diagonally. Bring your material over top. It will pull your material down, but as long as you get that corner lined up, everything else will fall into place. And then pin that into place as well. And you're going to do that on both sides, both of your short sides. When you're choosing the elastic that you want to use for your masks, the narrower the elastic, the more comfortable it's going to be. If you can find the round elastic, that tends to be the most comfortable because it is the most narrow. The round elastic is usually about 1/8 inch elastic. This elastic is about 1/4 inch wide. And if possible, you don't want to go any wider than that. The thicker it is, the more uncomfortable it gets behind your ears, especially if you're wearing it for any length of time. Now you can pin all the way along if you want. You don't have to, it's up to you. If it's somebody who's just starting out sewing, pinning it just makes things a little bit easier. And fortunately, this is a mask pattern that works very, very well for beginner sewers. So our next step is going to be sewing around the 4 edges. I usually start fairly close to the corner on one of my edges. It doesn't really matter which one, but you want to have it so that your longer edge is going to be the last that's sewn. I'm going to leave a space because ultimately we're going to turn it inside out. Just to show anybody who's not necessarily using a machine how to do it, I'm going to do a little bit of hand sewing first just to give you an idea. So I always double my thread over when I'm hand sewing things like this. It just that extra little bit of strength in your thread, and when you're machine sewing, you're using 2 threads anyway. So tie knot in the end. You're going to start on either side. It doesn't really matter. You want anywhere from 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch seam allowance if you're somebody who has a little bit smaller of a face. If you use a wider seam allowance, it can shrink the mask a little bit, so it might fit a bit better. So you can do your first stitch, it's just a straight across, super simple stitch. But when you get to your second stitch, instead of going straight forward with your next stitch and going along this way, you're going to double back to close in the gap to your first stitch. And then your next one, you're going to go forward, so you're going to start right in the hole or right close to the hole for your last stitch. And you're going to continue on all the way around, making sure you close in so you have a solid line of stitches all the way around. When you go to finish it off, you're gonna slide your needle under and tie off your knot. Nice and simple. You feed it under, make a loop, go through your loop twice, and then pull it tight. I usually double it just so that I'm sure it's not gonna slip. So if you're hand sewing, you're just going to do that stitch all the way around before you tie it off, leaving 1 inch to 1.5 inches of open space that is not stitched. If you're machine sewing it, same thing. I'm going to start fairly close to one of the corners, but not right at it, so that I'm going to leave a bit of a gap. You're going to start with your regular forward stitch. I tend to use a fairly long stitch. You can use whatever length you're comfortable using. You want to do a couple stitches forward, reverse it, so then it's less likely to unravel. And you're just going to go all the way to the corner. Once I get close into the corner, I do shorten up and use a very short stitch. That way I make sure I catch the elastic with as many stitches as possible. I also reverse over it again with a short stitch, again just to make sure I've got that elastic well sewn in. Go back to about where I want my seam allowance. I leave my needle down and just turn my material, so it's all done in one. Now the key when you're turning it with the elastic is you want to make sure that the elastic is tucked back, so you're not going to be doing it all the way along, because you want most of the elastic loose when you get to the other end. So I make my stitch longer again and just sew along, guiding it along so I keep the seam allowance I want. Same thing when I get close to the corner, shorten the stitch up again, reverse back short, and then I bring it to where I want my seam allowance. We're going to do the same thing across the 3 sides until we get to that last one where we're going to leave a gap. Shorten my stitch. If you're using pins with a machine, once you have it in place where you want, if you pull the pin out before your needle's going to hit it, you're less likely to break your needle. This old machine is fairly simple to replace needles. I can't speak to what the newer machines are, but I prefer not to break them when I can avoid it. Again, going down this side, you want to make sure that your elastic is well tucked out of the way. It's pretty close on this one, so just tuck it back and make sure it's not going to get caught all the way down. Shorten my stitch. Reverse it. And back to my seam allowance. Normally I would use a thread that is the same color as the material. It's going to be on the inside anyway, so it doesn't matter as much for this, but there is a chance that some of your stitching is going to show. So I would recommend using the same color thread as the material. However, for demonstrative purposes, using a color that shows up well is a little bit easier than using the same color. So once I'm on this last side, I'm going to leave that gap. So once I get to wherever I want, however long I want that gap to be, and you need to leave it long enough that you can turn the material inside out. The more you make of them, you can get a better judge of how big you want to leave it. But I would say you want to leave probably at least 1.5 inches just to make it easy. So this is just a little over 1.5 inches. So that's good enough. So when I get to the end, I'm going to reverse the stitch back on the long stitch for a few stitches, finish off, and clip that off. So once we have that done, we're going to turn it inside out. I find it easiest to pull one of the corners through first on the opposite side, and the rest of it tends to follow fairly easily, but we'll just turn this all the way inside. Once you have it pretty well turned inside out, to get the corners to pop out nicely, you can give your elastic a bit of a tug. You don't want to be pulling super hard, but a nice firm tug will also give you a good idea if your elastic's firmly attached. If not, you can always go back and stitch over the elastic again. So now that we have it the right way in, our elastics are on the outside. If you're using a patterned material, your pattern's going to be brighter on this side. we have to close this gap up. So we're just gonna stitch straight across. I'm gonna start a little bit back from where it's stitched and finished on either side just to catch the very edge. So you're gonna use a very narrow seam allowance on this, just right along the edge of that material. Same thing, you're gonna do a few stitches forward, reverse a few stitches, and then stitch across that opening. Make sure you catch the entire opening, reverse, go back forward to the end, and then you can clip off your thread. So the next step is going to be putting the pleats into the mask. I do all my pleats on the same side, so it ends up looking a little bit more like the medical mask. Really doesn't matter which way you end up doing your pleats, it all amounts to the same thing. So you don't have to measure your pleats. For an adult size mask, I start the pleats so that they're roughly an inch down, about an inch below. It doesn't have to be exact, and I do them so that they're roughly an inch wide. It's just kind of a rough guess. And I pin them in place. You can also iron them in place, works as well, but pinning just holds things together a little bit better. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. If they're not exactly even on both sides, the only time you're really going to notice it is when you're looking at the mask when it's sitting on a table. So they don't have to be perfectly even. Again, roughly an inch and roughly an inch wide, and then you can pin it into place. When I'm doing my second pleat, I have it so that the top starts at the bottom of the next one. So again, I do mine so that they're all on the same side. You can do them facing the other direction. It doesn't matter. Whichever way you find works best for you is perfectly fine. And even if you do some and you find out later that you did one backwards, again, it doesn't really matter. So by putting them in an inch, I only put 2 pleats in. You can make them narrower if you would like as well and put more pleats in. The joy of this pattern is it's very forgiving. So once you have those pinned in place and you're happy with where they are, you want to try and line up the edges as best you can so that it's nice and simple to sew. And your last step is going to be to sew those pleats in. I use a fairly narrow seam allowance on this last edge, and I start right up in the corner. Again, that way I just catch that elastic one more time and I'm going to get it sewn in that much better. Same thing as before, you're going to sew a couple of stitches forward, a couple back, and then just down all the way across the pleats. I'm going to use a fairly narrow seam allowance right in through the elastic at the end. Reverse a couple of stitches. Back forward, and we're going to do the same thing on the other side. So once you have that done, clip the threads at the corner, pull out all your pins, and your mask is done. These are also fairly simple if the elastic breaks or gets too stretched out. You can just clip the elastic off and sew a new elastic just in on one side. Fairly easy to repair. We did have some questions at one point about putting in some sort of metal nose piece. You could if you wanted. I didn't in this, and I would be hesitant to put a metal nose piece in the reusable masks just because eventually it's going to break long before the rest of your mask will break. However, in this one, if you wanted to, before you close up your seam, all you would do is you would stitch another row below that all the way across, slide in whatever you're going to use for your metal nose piece. Pipe cleaner was one suggestion that might work. Slide that in and then sew it up, and that would become the top with your metal nose piece if you chose to put one in. So that's just the simple how to make a very simple mask. Like I said, it is a very simple one to adjust the size on. If you have somebody who's a little bigger, a little smaller, it is a very simple pattern to do if you have someone who's just learning to sew, and it is fairly easy to do by hand sewing as well. If anybody has any questions that come up while they're trying to do the pattern, any suggestions, feel free to give the library a shout and get in touch with them. If there's any questions that the library staff can't answer, they can easily get a hold of me as well, and I'm always willing to help out where I can.